Hello, my friends, and welcome to February, the second month of a lucky year, right? 2021. And welcome to Sanctuary Online. So we're very excited tonight to welcome everyone to February and to the programming we have. A couple of housekeeping bits. It would be fabulous if you were able to enable your video while you're on here with us tonight. And we want to make sure we see your faces. Also, we want to make sure that you're in gallery view, which means instead of seeing one person speak, you can see everyone speak, as this is part of our, goal and vision to create community across many friendships and pod boundaries, I guess, when we're safe tonight. Also, if you'd open your chat box, and this is a great way to first off give us your first and last name. Many of you that your whatever shows up on your Zoom box isn't necessarily who you are, but if you want to do that, and then if we don't have your mailing address yet, it's a great thing to do that. If you type your mailing address in there, we'll go ahead and send you one email. We won't spam you, but we'll send you one email each week, and it kind of says what happened last week, and if you missed it, it gives you the link directly into the recording on our YouTube channel. And it also tells you what's coming up next week and the next few weeks ahead. So it kind of just keeps you informed from a Sanctuary Online perspective. Also tonight, you want to let us know where you're calling in from, maybe how you got connected with us. And there's a text feature we have that a lot of people are taking advantage of. I don't know about you, but a lot of us these days seem to run into one, then the other, then the other. And so if you'd like to receive a text on Tuesday afternoon, put your, just go ahead and put your cell phone number in the chat box, and Barb will grab that up, and she'll put you on our database, and we'll send you out a text next week. If you want to be private about your cell phone, that's fine too. You can still get to Barb through a private messenger. And anyway, really excited that you're all here tonight. And we're also really excited to announce Harlequin's newest button. So Button is a very teeny tiny little girl. Mandy, I think you were, or Edie, you were able to go out and give her a little hug. You were fast enough to catch her.
She's not very speedy yet. She was only about 26 hours old, so she didn't put up much of a fuss.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Harlequin put up a fuss when her baby was not by her. So,
yes, normally you get your butt chewed by a goat when you pick up the baby. Absolutely, it's a good thing. But we need to give them loving like that and get them used to people and being handled and being friendly. I think Tom named her, right, Ken?
Yes, that's right.
For that little button on her nose, little black dot on her nose.
Well, I was feeding her.
And it just seemed the right thing, Tom. She's cute as a.
Oh yeah, Button.
Oh, good. But anyway, we just wanted to keep you up to date on some of the things to smile about that are happening at Sanctuary Online. So February is a big month, my friend. Ken tonight is doing part one of a two-part series inspired by his teachings from our December Advent series. Ken did a little tiny teaching each week, and it was so appreciated that folks asked him back. And so we've got part one tonight, how the great religions began, and next week, what the great religions believe. So I for one, Ken, I'm really excited about tonight. We also are in the process of getting a guest panel together for the 16th of February. And that is going to be, we've asked the people who were in our Kwanzaa panel, if any of you made that on December 30th, I think it was. Anyway, those folks will come back, and we're gonna build that out to be a wonderfully educational night. And then our book club, back to the favorite books, of course. We've chosen Can't Wait to Get to Heaven for this week. So I'm sure those of you who are reading are already started. Yes?
Yes.
Getting into it a little better than
Yes.
Our last book had a slow start, but a steamy ending to it. So, and then, oh, doggone it, Cyril, I missed your slide up here. Here we go at Fanny Flag, Can't Wait to Get to Heaven. Again, February 23rd, mark your calendars and begin your reading appropriately. For those of you who are new and maybe haven't been to one of our book clubs, it is one of the most enjoyed weeks of our month, and people come even if they haven't read the book. So all are welcome. And I think someone didn't come last week because they didn't have the book finished and they didn't want to have a spoiler alert, but all good, all good. And then in March, we're pretty excited. Just like our Advent series in December, March of this year has 5 Tuesday nights in it. And the first 4, we're going to lift a portion of our global curriculum that is Creating a Life That Matters. We often refer to that as CLM. And so pretty neat. It'll be a nice series through March, a great time during Lent to do some reflective work. And so we're inviting all of y'all back. And any of your folks from your churches, any people who've always heard of CLM but couldn't get to it, we will be going online. And the more folks who come, the better. We're actually going to be testing putting the entirety of the curriculum, redesigning it, and putting the entirety of the curriculum up onto Zoom later this year. So if you know anybody who's been there before or hasn't been able to make it to CLM, we'd love people to show up and we'd love the feedback, as we believe we really can put large numbers of CLM through people through CLM once again. And the last week of the month, we are our monthly book club. We're just not quite sure of the book yet. We might try and do one of the source books of CLM, Rediscovering Relationship with Myself. We're not sure on that one yet. More to come. Whew, that's a lot of information. Barb, I'm going to toss it over to you. And this month, we are going to be doing we'll open each week with a special series. So Barb Crabtree, over to you, my friend.
Thank you. Well, last week we did if you were on, we did a teaser, and Edie, you and Mandy were really close on this. We're going to focus on Black History Month. So we started off with a question: what do Kamala Harris, Common, the rapper, and Katherine Johnson all have in common with each other, but not in common with Amanda Gorman? And the answer is the 3 on the left all went to historically Black colleges and universities, one of the HBCUs, and Amanda graduated from Harvard. So this month, in honor of Black History Month, we're going to take a look at HBCUs and take a look at their role and what they're all about, and learn a little bit more about them. So go ahead, please, Joby.
Yep.
So first of all, the acronym you may have heard in the news or seen, and you may already know, HBCU is the acronym that's used, the abbreviation for Historically Black Colleges and Universities. And they're called Historically Black because mostly they were founded between the time period of the end of the US Civil War and before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that's not entirely true. Out of the 101 colleges and universities that identify as one of the HBCUs, there are actually 3 that were founded before that 1861 timeframe of the Civil War. But mostly, they're between the Civil War and the Civil Rights Act, and mostly they're located in the southern United States. So quite a few of them are in Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, West Virginia, the Carolinas, and Texas. You see a list of just a few of the pennants over there, and we'll talk, about a couple of them as the rest of February goes on. We'll learn a little bit more, but just some quick facts about them. About 25% of African American graduates with STEM degrees come from HBCUs. So that's STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. The HBCUs provide degrees in they provide doctoral, master's, bachelor's, and associate degrees. Like any universities, they have different specialties and things, but they do provide between them the collective range of all of the degrees. And collectively, their enrollment is nearly 300,000 students at any given time. So go ahead to the next one. We'll take a quick look at some of the notable alumni. They Their graduates include politicians. Kamala Harris is from Howard University. James Clyburn, if you've heard that name, graduated from South Carolina State. He is currently the number 3 ranking congressperson in the House of Representatives in the US. He's serving as the majority whip. There are scientists like Katherine Johnson. If you saw the movie Hidden Figures, she was the one that John Glenn said, get that computer woman. She is from West Virginia State University. Lonnie Johnson is an engineer from Tuskegee. W.E.B. Du Bois is from Fisk. There are actors and musicians like Oprah Winfrey, Spike Lee, and Common. Oprah Winfrey went to Tennessee State. Spike Lee went to Morehouse, and Common to Florida A&M. And then civil rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr. from Morehouse, Ralph David Abernathy from Clark Atlanta, and Marion Wright Edelman from Spelman. So really all walks of life, and they go on to do, their graduates go on to make, incredibly significant contributions to all of our lives, together in this world, across all disciplines. So that's it for tonight. The rest of February, we're going to pick out an individual, three individual universities, and do a spotlight on their work and who they are, and learn a little bit more about each of them.
Thank you, Barb. I really appreciate that. And I love that we're adding a little bit to our, doing our part in education and learning during Black History Month. Ken, before I hand it over to you, the way we're gonna run tonight is, again, all of you know how to pop out your chat box. If you're not familiar with that, if you go down to the bottom of your screen, there's a whole bunch of little icons, and one of them says chat. If you pop that out, it should pop out to the right of your screen. And if you have any questions as Ken's going along, go ahead and type them into the box to everyone, and that's what it will say. And that will pop up into everyone. We've got Barb and Cheryl and I will be kind of monitoring the chat box. And then Ken, I know you've grouped the religions that you're going to speak about tonight from the different countries, right, from which they began. And so
Yes.
say we have 2 or 3 that start out from India. After Ken's done with those 2 or 3, we'll take a pause and we'll gather any of the questions from the chat box. And then Ken, you guys can go back and forth. Then we'll jump back into the next set of religions from a certain country. We'll do those, same thing, we'll pause and grab those questions out of the chat box. So if you'd like to do that, I appreciate that. When we do pick your question, what I'll normally do, say, Kelly, if you were to ask a question in the chat box, I would read it and I'd say, hey, Kelly, you've asked a question here, sounds really interesting, boom. And then you would unmute yourself. And you can do that by just pushing your space bar down or holding it down. And then you can engage Ken directly and we'll have a conversation. Does that make sense? All right, my friend Ken, we're excited. We're all here. We've got a packed house, so it's all yours.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Joby. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Let me start off by saying that recently the world has shrunk. And what I mean by that is that as recently as my grandparents' generation, anyone who was different because they lived in a different place, or they ate different food, or they spoke a different language, or they looked different, or they worshiped differently, was very suspicious, was very distrusted just because of those differences. Now, I hope we are beginning to learn that much of that distrust was the result of misinformation or no information, because now being a good neighbor doesn't just mean understanding the people in your neighborhood. It literally means trying to understand every person who lives on this planet. Recent events have reminded us that if we don't find a way to turn down the heat on this distrust and suspicion we have of each other, we're simply not going to make it. And one of the most important ways we can do that is by learning about the different faiths by which people live their lives. Remember, there are not very many experiences that are common to every race and tribe and clan and nation that we know anything about from the beginning of time, but religion is one of those things. We know of no people anywhere at any time who did not have some kind of religious belief and religious practice. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to try to attempt to bring a little more understanding. Tonight, we're going to do that by looking at how 10 of the world's great religions began. We're going to do that geographically. We'll look first at the religions of India, then the religions of China and Japan, and then the religions of the West. And as Joe said, after each of those, we'll pause to see if you have any questions or comments. We're going to have one slide that's up at the beginning of each of the religions with just a few foundational facts about the origin of the religion. If you are interested in those after you see them and having a copy of those, if you'll just comment, tell us that in the chat box. Be sure we got your email address and we'll be glad to send them to you. So let's begin by trying to imagine how this whole thing began. Imagine about 30,000 years ago, two of our ancestors sitting in the mouth of a cave watching the sun as it rises and sets every single day until one of them turns to the other and says, "Who is doing that?" Now, at that time, those ancestors were just like all other creatures in that they ate and they drank and they slept and they reproduced, but they were unique in one way. They asked questions. And the minute they started asking those kinds of questions, the most important figure in religious history began to emerge, and that was the storyteller. Now, whether we call them shaman or priests or imams or rabbis or pastors down through history, the most effective influencers in religion have been the storytellers, because they don't just tell ordinary stories, they tell what we call answer stories, because their stories are created to try to answer a very important question. Remember, religion tries to answer the question why things are. Science tries to answer the question how things are. That's why science and religion are not in conflict with each other. That's why faith and reason are not in conflict with each other. They're looking into the same room, but just looking in through different windows. So a storyteller appears to our ancient ancestors and says, well, that sun is a big ball of fire, and the sun spirit gets on it every morning and rides it across the sky so they can look down at us, and then puts it away at night, and the next day rides it across the sky again. And so our ancestors said, well, what about the days when it's cloudy and rainy and we don't get to see the sun? And the storyteller said, oh, on those days, you have offended him. On those days, you've done something to make him mad and he won't show up for you. And the people said, well, what if we make him so mad he never comes back and we have to live in the dark and the cold and we can't go hunting? And the storyteller said, that's easy. Just go up on that mountain over there every morning and look at him and tell him how wonderful and beautiful he is, how important he is, sing some songs to him, pray to him, and then he'll always come back. So the people started doing that. But then they looked around and they said, if the sun has a sun spirit, then the moon must also have a moon spirit. So we have to figure out how to keep the moon happy too. And before long, the people were preoccupied with how to appease the angry spirit of the thunder and the busy spirit of the wind and the gentle spirit of the rivers and the mysterious spirit of the forests and the restless spirit of the oceans. And that was humanity's first religion. It's called nature worship or animism. And it is the belief that everything, animate and inanimate, has its own unique living spirit within it. So then one day, two little boys, imagine, were playing in a river and one of them drowned and the other didn't. And so the people went to the storyteller and said, why did that little boy drown and that one didn't? And the storyteller might have said, well, the family spirit of that little boy who drowned just wasn't strong enough to protect him. And so the people said, families have spirits too? And the storyteller said, yes, my family's spirit lives in a frog, but it's not an ordinary frog. It's a frog as big as that mountain, and it's got one big eye right in the middle of its head and a big gold horn. And the people said, we've never seen such a frog. And the storyteller said, no, but look at this. And he pulled out a big piece of wood carved into the shape of a frog with one big eye and one big gold horn coming out of its head. And he said, this is my family's spirit, and we put it in a special place in our house, and we make offerings of food and flowers to it, and we pray to it, and we sing to it, and it protects us. And so the people said, we got to get one of those. And it wasn't too long before images began appearing everywhere. Some in the shapes of tigers, and others bears, and others eagles, and some were half crocodiles and half human. And all of the people had images on their paths to protect them and in their homes to protect them. And then one day, a family on one side of the river got in a fight with a family on the other side of the river. And the storyteller went to one of the families and said, listen, if you think your family spirit is stronger than their family spirit, pray to him and tell him to hurt them, and then you can win this. And so the people started praying to their spirit to be on our side and help us defeat them. And then they said, wait a minute, if ours can hurt them, can't theirs hurt us? And the storyteller said, oh, that's easy to solve. Look at this. And he pulled out a tiny little image of his frog, and he said, make a little bitty image of your family spirit and wear it around your neck or around your waist, and it'll protect you. And that's how talismans and amulets became part of idol worship. Archaeology tells us that every pre-literate people we know of switched at some point from nature worship to idol worship. And so this became more and more complicated, and it continued literally for millennia until a group of people about 8,000 years ago on the northern banks of the Ganges River in India threw all of that away and said, why don't we all just sit down by the river and sing some songs and pray? And they started doing that. And it wasn't too long before they learned to write, and they started writing down their songs and their prayers. And those writings became the Vedas. They became the oldest sacred writings of the oldest religion we know anything about, Hinduism. So Joby, if we can see that first slide. So Hinduism was born in prehistory, so we do not have an individual founder for it. It originated in India. Its sacred writings include the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Kama Sutra, Vajrayana, and there are some other writings as well. But it is the oldest religion that we know anything about that meets the criteria that we call religions today. Now, since we don't know that much about exactly how it began, we're going to talk a lot more about it next week. So we're going to move on now to the second religion of India, and it is the religion of Buddhism. Joby. Buddhism was founded in the 6th century BCE. It is called the religion of the enlightened one. It was founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha. It originated in India. Its sacred writings include the Tripitaka, which is the 3 baskets of wisdom, and a number of others as well. Thank you, Joe. So about 2,500 years ago, on the banks of the Ganges River near the foot of the Himalaya Mountains, there was a sect of Hindu people called the Sakyas. And the king and queen of the Sakyas had been praying for a child. And finally, they had a son, and they named him Siddhartha. And this son, Siddhartha, grew up in the most privileged, luxurious kind of life you can imagine. He grew up inside the palace and the grounds of the palace, and he was never allowed to go out of them. At age 12, he went through a celebration, a rite of passage called putting on the sacred thread, where he was initiated into his parents' religion of Hinduism and made a pledge for himself to be a good Hindu. And he was immediately sent away to start studying Hinduism with the priests. At age 16, he got married to Princess Yasodharma, and they lived very happily together within the palace for about 10 years. Now, the time he was 26 years old, Siddhartha Gautama, the story says, had never been outside the palace or the palace grounds. But when he was 26, he went out with his bodyguard named Chana. And outside in the real world, he saw a man who was skin and bones, who was obviously in great pain. And he said to Chana, "What is that?" And Chana said, "That is illness. Anyone can become ill." And then he saw an old man bent over with gray hair and a beard walking very slowly. And he said, "What is that?" And Chana said, "That is old age. Everyone becomes old." And then they passed the funeral procession and he pointed at the corpse and he said, "What is that?" And Chandra said, "That is death. Everyone dies." And by the time he got back into the palace and had seen all of these things, which he had never even become acquainted with in his very privileged life, he began to ruminate about this and reach the conclusion that all of life is suffering. And his Hindu religion taught him that every person has to come back and be reincarnated and live again and again until you learn all of your lessons. And he decided that he had to find a way to end this suffering so that people did not have to keep coming back until they were released from the wheel of rebirth. And so he went to his family and said, "I'm going to leave the palace. I'm going to become a monk." And they were devastated. His wife had just had their first child, but no one could dissuade him. And so he left, and for 7 years he wandered around as a possessionless, begging monk. He went and asked all of the gurus and all of the famous people what the answer was to suffering, and no one had an answer. And finally he sat down one day under a wild fig tree and he said, "The answer has to be inside of me." And he declared that he would sit there and meditate and not leave until he had the answer. And then after a long period of time, a lot of disagreement about how long, he said, "I have found the key to wisdom." He called it the first law of life. And he stood up and started teaching, and his disciples began coming around him and following him. And that became the religion of Buddhism. And today there are about 370 million professing Buddhists in the world. The second religion that we're going to talk about from India, third, is the religion of Jainism. We can see that, Joe. Jainism is called the religion of Mahavira the Conqueror. It was founded in the 6th century before the Common Era. The founder was not a Putta Vardhamama. He was called Mahavira, the great hero. It originated in India. The sacred writings are called the Agamas. Thank you, Joe. So Prince Siddhartha Gautama was not the only person who was trying to find a way to reform Hinduism. In fact, their life stories are so similar. For a long time, people thought that they were actually the same person. But now scholars have proven that these were actually two very different people. Even though Mahavira also was a prince, he grew up in a palace, but in the kingdom of Mogdhai. He grew up in the palace at Versailles. And one of the things we'll notice about a lot of these founders of religions is that there are divinity stories about them, about their childhoods, special magical divinity stories about things that happened in their childhood to present the idea that they were recognized as spiritual leaders so early. And the divinity legend for Mahavira goes like this. When he was just a boy, he and his friends were playing in the garden, and a rogue elephant rampaged directly toward them. And all of his friends ran in terror, but he stood there and the elephant stopped right in front of him and bowed to him. And he got on the elephant and rode it back into the barn where it was supposed to be. And from that experience, he got the name Mahavira, or the great hero. So at age 12, he also underwent putting on the sacred thread, became a Hindu, was sent away to study, but he came back immediately and told his parents that he hated the priests because they were vain and they were arrogant and they were corrupt. And so at 19, he married, lived in the palace for a while, but then his parents, the king and the queen, died together from starvation. In those days, Hinduism believed that if you starved yourself to death, it was a holy death and you did not have to come back through reincarnation. After his parents starved themselves to death, he went to his older brother, who was then the king, and said, now I'm going to do 12 years of mourning as a monk, and I'm going to do it in silence. So for 12 years, he wandered around in total silence, thinking about how he might change and improve his religion of Hinduism. At the end of those 12 years, he said, I have found the answer to how to end suffering. And he began teaching that to people. And that's how the religion of Jainism began. And today there are about 10 million Jainists in the world. And the final religion we're going to talk about from India is the religion of Zoroastrianism. It's called the religion of the sacred fire. It was founded in the 6th century before the Common Era. Joey, you've got that slide? Thank you. It actually began in ancient Persia, which is now Iran, but almost all Zoroastrians live in India today, where they are called Parsis. Their sacred writings are the Avestas. So even today, if you go to Bombay, India, late in the afternoon, amidst the colorful crowds of people who will be gathered everywhere, you will see a procession of tall, dignified men, all wearing white gowns, all wearing woven girdles. They go to the edge of the water and thank you, Joe, you can take that slide down now. They go to the edge of the water and they carry out a ritual which ends by saying, I praise aloud the thought well thought, I praise aloud the word well spoken, I praise aloud the deed well done, and then they disperse into the crowd. They're not Buddhists and they're not Hindus. The people in India call them the people of the fire, or fire worshipers, because they keep fires burning all the time in their temple. They're called Parsis, even though they left Persia generations ago. The ancient ancestors of those people lived northwest of India near the Caspian Sea. And at first, their religion, we know, was a very simple one. But then they developed this pantheon of lots of gods, and they started building lots of complex temples, and they developed this very complicated priesthood. And they developed a very strong belief that their priests had supernatural powers, that their priests were able to do things that normal humans couldn't do, including being an intercessory for between them and their gods. And so the priests were called magi, and their ability to do these supernatural things was called magic. And over time, this religion became so corrupt because so much power was given to these priests, and they went around claiming all kinds of abilities that they didn't have. And so the religion was corrupt. And then in the 6th century before the Common Era, in the town of Azerbaijan, in the family of Spitama, a son was born, and they named him Zarathustra. He was later called Zoroaster. And some of the magical legend stories about him in his childhood include one that says the priests were so threatened by him when he was born that they threw him into a fire, but when they came back later, he was walking around in the flames. Another is that they took him and put him into a den of wolves, but the wolves nurtured him and the goats came and fed him milk. At age 15, he went through a rite of passage called putting on the girdle, which made him a part of his family's religion. But his people were always warring. They were fighting every tribe and clan around them. And Zoroaster spent many years helping the people who were wounded, helping the people who were sick and poor. And finally, this suffering became so great that he told his family he was going up into the mountains. He was going to go away and live his life as a hermit. And so he went up to Mount Sabalan, and he remained there for a long time, trying to figure out how to reform his religion. And finally, his answer came as he watched the sun set and rise one day, and he came back and said, I have the key to wisdom. I know how to end suffering. But nobody would believe him. His parents wouldn't believe him. His friends wouldn't believe him. And finally, one of his cousins said, go to the king and queen, go to the royal family. If you can convert them, then you'll be okay. So he went to the king and he said to the king, I want to debate the magi. I want to debate these priests. And the king said, if you can answer my questions better than they can, then I will be the first follower of your new religion. And so the debate lasted for 3 days. And the story says that at the end of the debate, the king looked at Zoroaster and said, you are truly the prophet of the one wise God. Then the king ordered 12,000 cows to be killed and their hides to be prepared as scrolls. And all of the teachings of Zoroaster were written down on these scrolls, and that became the Avestas, the sacred book of the Zoroastrians. And today, there are only about 200,000 of them left in the world, but we consider them important because of the influence that that religion had on Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which we'll talk a lot more about next week. So those are the ways, the religions we consider, the Indian religions, all originated. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Yep, Ken, we have two great questions. The first one coming from Kristen. So Kristen, you can unmute, which you've already done. Look at how efficient you are. Thank you. And speak directly to Mr. Ken.
Hi, Ken. How are you?
Good.
I went on to a yoga retreat, like a week-long retreat a couple years ago that had several classes. And one of the things they talked about was they described Buddhism as a philosophy and not really a religion.
Mhm.
And like what they're like was, well, you could be a Jewish Buddhist, a Christian Buddhist, a Hindu Buddhist. Does that fit? I'm thinking you might have had more religious education than the person speaking there. Does that fit with the things you've learned and the way it's adapted over time?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Buddhism is often called the atheist religion because there is no teaching in Buddhism about any kind of supernatural power or life after death. And so, technically speaking, Buddha was not trying to start a new religion. He was trying to reform Hinduism. And he did that by setting up a set of principles, which we'll talk about next week, that would allow people to live good lives, which would hopefully then really have to release them from the wheel of samsara, the wheel of rebirth. But then, particularly as Buddhism moved from India out into Eastern Asia, it took on more of quality of a religion. People actually began to worship Buddha instead of just adhering to the principles that Buddha taught. So yes, Buddhism is considered a religion because people made it that way, although Buddha himself did not necessarily intend for it to be that.
Isn't that what always happens? Thank you.
I was gonna say the same thing, Kristen. That sounds like another guy I know. Yeah. Second question, and then we'll move on to the next religions. Ken, from Aaron.
So Ken, I noticed that when you did the you put that symbol up there, that looks like a swastika. And I wonder if that was the origination of that symbol.
Of the swastika? Well, I don't know that there's any direct connection there. You know, Native American peoples also used the swastika. There were several of the nations of Native Americans who, in decorating clothing and so forth, used the swastika. So it appears around the world in a lot of different cultures. I don't know specifically where the Nazis adapted it from. If they did, that would be an interesting thing to try to know. But it has appeared in numerous different cultures throughout history.
Thank you. Can I add just one more question? Because
yes,
I'm curious about bodhisattvas in Buddhism, because we're also talking about religious leaders that emerge from each of these, and bodhisattvas are that in Buddhism. Can you talk a little bit more about their role, how they emerged?
Yes, next week.
Oh, okay. Tune in.
You know what? Tune in next week. We'll talk about the bodhisattvas next week as a part of what the great religions believe. Yes.
And Cheryl, I'm going to push your question off, obviously, on Jainism to next week as well. Great answer, Ken. And then Barb, you've put your post in the chat room there. So let's go ahead in loving and appreciating everyone's time. Ken, I'm going to have you start the religions of China. Okay.
Yes.
There you
go.
If
you can put up the first slide there.
Yep.
The great religion of China, of course, is Confucianism. It was founded in the 6th century before the Common Era. The founder was born as Zhu Kong, then became Kung Fu Tzu, and then Confucius. It originated in China. The sacred writings are primarily called the Analects and the Five Qing. So in China, for thousands of years, the Chinese people were nature worshipers, but then they also had another religious element in their lives, which was ancestor worship. This is the first time we're encountering ancestor worship. They believed that their dead ancestors had the power to influence their lives in the moment, in life, in negative or positive ways. And so they worshiped and venerated their ancestors. About 2,500 years ago in the province of Lu, there was an emperor. His name was Hai, and he wanted a son to venerate him and worship him after he died. And when he was 70 years old, he finally had a son, and he named him Jiu Kang. And this child is reputed to have been very precocious from a very early age. At a very early age, he took on several very responsible positions in the government. And by the time he was 23 years old, he was known as a great philosopher and teacher, and he was given the name Confucius, which means the great sage or the great philosopher. When he was 23 years old, his mother died, and he said, I'm going to resign all of my positions and I'm going to mourn for 3 years. And during that 3 years, he did nothing but study philosophy and ethics and poetry. And after that, he announced himself to be a teacher, and rapidly he had over 3,000 different students and followers. And when he was asked, what is the heart of your philosophy? He said, do not do unto others what you do not want them to do unto you. By the time he died, he had developed a whole system of ethics and philosophy. And he said, this is the way you live the good life. His philosophy was designed to live the good life. He said, the enemy of the good life is ignorance, and therefore knowledge is the solution to that. Throughout his life, Confucius was asked to talk about God, to talk about a life after death, but he always refused. He always said, it's up to us to figure out how to live lives of justice and peace in this world, and just leave everything else up to God. So there are similarities between Confucius and Buddha here, Kristen, because it is the followers of Confucius who really made Confucianism a religion. His was more of an ethical teaching of how to live the good life. And there are today about 100 million adherents to the religion of Confucianism around the world. The second religion we're going to talk about from China is Taoism. It is called the religion that cannot be understood, or the religion of the way. It was founded in the 6th century before the Common Era. The founder was Lao Tzu. The place of origination was China, and the sacred writing is the Tao Te Ching. Now, Confucius and Lao Tzu lived at the same time. And when Confucius began to hear stories about this other philosopher who was gaining all of this attention, he went to meet him, and they spent several days together. Some people say as many as 10 days together. And then Confucius came back to his followers, and his followers said, tell us, what does he teach? And Confucius said, some of his teachings are easy, and some of his teachings are hard, and most of his teachings are impossible to understand. And so that's how Taoism got the name of the religion that it is impossible to understand. Lao Tzu was born, his name was Li Pin Yang because he was born in the province of Yang. And we know very little about him, except that at an early age, he became the keeper of the archives of the province of Yang. And he apparently kept that job until he was 90 years old. When he was 90 years old, he looked around and he said, the political leaders, the religious leaders, they're all so corrupt that I cannot live in this province any longer. And he announced that he was leaving the province of Yang. So he went to the gate to walk through it and leave the province. And one of two things happened. There are two different stories here. One story says that he dropped a little book on the ground before he walked through the gate and was never seen or heard from again. Another story says he handed a little book to the guard at the gate before he walked through and was never seen or heard from again. Regardless of that, the guard looked at it, recognized that it might be important, and it actually has become the smallest sacred writing of any great religion. It's less than 5,000 words total. It's called the Tao Te Ching, or the Way. And this guard took it to the authorities, and the authorities looked at it, and they were so impressed with it that they began spreading the word of what was in the Tao Te Ching. And that's the way the religion of Taoism began. It's also called the religion that almost did not happen, because if the guard had not picked up the book, or if they'd thrown it away, or if he just kept it to himself, there would be no Taoism. And today there are 5 million Taoists in the world. The last religion we're going to look at is from Japan. The unique religion of Japan is Shinto. So if we can see that, Shinto is like Hinduism in that it has a pre-literate founding, so that we don't know if there was an individual founder. It originated in Japan. The sacred writings include the Kojiki, the record of the ancients, the Nihon, the chronicles of Japan, and the Vengishiki, the hymns and prayers of Shinto. Thank you. So Japan is a very young nation compared to China and India. And today there's a lot of influence in Japanese culture from India and China, including religious. But even before any of that happened, among the Aboriginal peoples of Japan, there was a religion. It was called Shinto, the way of the gods. And of all of the early religions we know about, of any peoples in the world, Shinto is the simplest because they had no sacred writings, they had no temples, they had no priesthood. They were just people who worshiped nature. They were nature worshipers. But there was one unique thing about Shinto, and it was that they also worshiped their Mikado. The Mikado was their leader, both a military and a spiritual leader. They believed that the Mikado, who later became the Japanese emperor, that the Mikado was the literal incarnation of the sun and the moon and the stars. And so they worshiped him as well as the elements of nature. Now, fortunately, in their sacred writings, we have their creation story about why they worship this Mikado. And it's a beautiful story, and here it is. It is that at the beginning of time, there were two gods, Izanagi and Izanami, and they stood on a bridge and looked down, and all they saw below the heavens was water. And so Izanagi took a jeweled spear and dipped it into the water and then pulled it out, and everywhere a drop of water fell back, one of the Japanese islands was created. So after they had created the islands, then they created 3 deities, the sun and the moon and the stars. And they named the sun goddess Amaterasu Amikami, and her first grandson was named Jimutino, and he became the first Mikado in their creation story. He was divine because he was literally descended from the sun. And so after him, every Mikado, every emperor was believed to be divine. You may remember at the end of World War II, one of the most difficult problems for the Japanese to deal with, but they believed even then that their emperor was divine. And so in addition to everything else, they had to deal with how can our divine emperor be defeated. So today there are many Japanese people who claim to be Buddhists or Confucianists, and as you mentioned, Kristen, religions like Buddhism and Confucianism, people can practice other religions and claim to embrace those philosophies at the same time. But today there are about 5 million Shintoists in the world. So before we move to the Western religions, do we have any questions real quick?
Nobody brave enough to put one in the chat room yet, Ken. Oh, okay. Kelly. Go ahead, Kelly, go ahead and unmute yourself and you can talk directly to Papa Ken.
I was just curious how they ended up reconciling that.
Yes, it was very difficult. And Paul, you're actually a military colonel retired. You may know more about this than I do. But as I understand it, part of the surrender of the Japanese was that they had to, and this may have just been internal. It may not have been among the requirement of the Allies, but at some point they had to denounce the divinity of the emperor, and it was a really traumatic experience, and a lot of writing has been done about it. You can Google this, and it was a national trauma for the Japanese to have to renounce the divinity of their emperor.
So after that, were there emperors divine still?
No.
That
Since then, there's been no claim of divinity for the emperors. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Paul, do you want to add anything to that?
So, no, I think not at all, Ken. I think thank you for that. I do have a question.
There you go.
I'd like to hear you comment about, Ken. Most of these religions you've talked about have sacred writings and identified leaders. And, you know, that's probably what helped them endure over time, but also what became their Achilles heel and so vulnerable for corruption. The sacred writings and identified. Could you just comment about that?
Yeah, that's just a fact. You just stated a fact. You know, the more we know about the creation stories, the origins of these religions, the more susceptible they become to corruption. Buddhism and Jainism were efforts to reform Hinduism. Christianity was a reform movement out of Judaism. You know, religions have a tendency toward corruption, and there is a need periodically, you know, for religions to be reformed and called back to their original teachings and values and beliefs, because anything that involves as many resources, as much human talent as religion does, is obviously going to lend itself to corruption. And so, yes, what you stated is just a fact. It becomes an Achilles heel, as those of us who have watched the abuse of the Bible, you know, can certainly attest to. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's where I was exactly going, Ken, is even as the meta narrative of great world religions, and then within those religions, I'm sure there's the same kind of heading toward corruption and difference of opinion and splintering, right, of the teaching.
Yes.
And that leads us to the.
Yeah, we'll talk quite a bit more about that next week. Yeah. Yes, the religions of the West. The first is going to be Judaism. Judaism was founded somewhere around the 13th century before the Common Era. The founder, some tradition says it was Abraham. Most contemporary Jewish scholars say that the religion of Judaism really began with Moses in Palestine, Canaan, which is today Israel. Sacred writings are the Hebrew scriptures. Sometimes we call them the Old Testament, consisting of the 5 books of the law called the Torah, and books of history and prophecy and other writings. So about between 3,500 and 4,000 years ago, in the city of Ur in the land of the Chaldees, there lived a man whose name was Abraham and his wife Sarah. And Abraham came to believe that he was being led by a God, not in nature or an idol, but a sky god. He believed that a God who lived in the sky was leading him. And so he took his entire family and began wandering north toward the land of Canaan. When they got to the land of Canaan, they were idol worshipers, but still Abraham insisted that he was following a God in the sky who was telling him what to do. Now, Abraham had a son. His name was Isaac. Isaac had a son. His name was Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons. Jacob was sometimes called Israel, and so their entire clan became known as the Israelites. When they got into Canaan, they prospered. They grew very strong. in Canaan. But then there was a great famine, and they moved the entire clan down to Egypt, where they were allowed to settle in the land of Goshen, where they again prospered and became very powerful. And after a while, the Egyptians became suspicious of them and afraid of them because of their power and their numbers. And so they enslaved them. And as slaves, the Israelites were forced back into idol worship. And to keep them from becoming any stronger, the Pharaoh actually ordered that all Israelite boy babies should be drowned. Just about that time, a Hebrew child was born named Moses. Through the ingenuity of his family, he was adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter, and he grew up in the palace, as an Egyptian with the Pharaoh. But as an adult, he discovered that he was himself a Hebrew. And then when he saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, he killed that taskmaster and was forced to flee into the land of Midian, where he attached himself to a very wealthy family of a man named Jethro. Eventually, Moses had this amazing experience with a burning bush and felt like the God in the sky was telling him to go back to Egypt and to demand that his people be set free. Then, after a number of catastrophic events, plagues upon the Egyptians, if you haven't read the book, you probably saw the movie. About 3,200 years ago, Moses went back and led the children of Israel out of Egypt in what is known as the Exodus. He told them that they were going to a promised land in the north called Canaan, and that they were being led by a God whose name was Yahweh. But he told them that they first of all had to go south to the mountain of Sinai to make a covenant with this God. And it was there on Sinai that Moses received the 10 Commandments, the first of which says, "You shall have no other gods before me." And most people believe that that is where the religion of Judaism actually began. And today there are about 14.5 million Jews in the world. The second religion of the West is the religion of Christianity. So for centuries, the Jews in Palestine had been expecting God to send them a deliverer, a Messiah, whom they call the Anointed One. And that expectation reached a fever pitch about 2,000 years ago when they fell under the oppression of Roman rule. In Judea, there was a king whose name was Herod, and he hated all of this talk about a Messiah. And then one day somebody came to him and said, Herod, let me go through that. The Christianity is often called the religion of love and justice. It was founded around the year 30 of the Common Era. The founder is called Jesus of Nazareth, also known as the Christ. The origin was in Palestine, today Israel, and the sacred writings are the Bible, consisting of the Hebrew scriptures plus the Christian scriptures that include 4 Gospels, 1 book of history, a number of epistles, letters, and 1 apocalyptic book. Thank you. So in Judea, the King Herod was hearing all of these prophecies about a Messiah, and he was very angry about this. And someone came to him and said, there are 3 magi here. Remember the magi? They said, there are 3 magi here from Persia, and they're loaded down with gifts. And they said they came here following a star to find a very special child, but they won't tell us where it is. That made him so angry that Herod decreed that every male child in Bethlehem under 2 years of age would be put to death. And so Joseph, who was Jesus' father, and Mary, who was his mother, took him, and they fled into Egypt until Herod died. And then they came back and settled in Nazareth, about 55 miles from Jerusalem. And there Jesus grew up as a traditional Jewish boy. We know that he went into the synagogue, and as was the custom, he would stand, read some scripture, and then interpret it. His interpretations were so profound, they were so simple, they were so understandable that even the scholars admired his wisdom and his teaching, and they gave him the name Rabbi, which means teacher. About that time, stories began to circulate about this strange prophet named John out in the desert who was preaching on the banks of the Jordan River. And then he was telling people they had to repent of their sins. And then he would immerse them in water. And then he would tell them about the Messiah who was going to come. And Jesus' mother, Mary, told him that this man, John, was actually his third cousin. And so Jesus went out to see what this was all about. And he heard John preach. And after he heard John preach, he asked John to baptize him. And John said, actually, you should be baptizing me. But John did baptize Jesus, and that was the beginning of Jesus' 3-year public ministry. During that public ministry, he chose disciples and he trained them. He preached a gospel of good news of God's love to every person. He talked about the coming reign of God on earth, and he intentionally and publicly aligned himself with the social and political and sexual outcasts of his day. So he was arrested for what he was teaching by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Jerusalem. He was charged with blasphemy and sedition. He was found guilty after a kind of kangaroo court, very disheveled, unorganized trial. He was found guilty of blasphemy and condemned to death. And he was taken with 2 others outside the gates of Jerusalem, and he was crucified there. The people who were responsible for killing Jesus were very open about why they did it. They said they did it because they wanted to destroy the movement that he had started. They said, if we strike the shepherd, then the sheep will all flee. But they were wrong about that, because 3 days after his death, the followers of Jesus started reporting seeing him and talking to him. And it was this belief that he was still with them that inspired them to keep spreading his gospel. And that's the way the religion of Christianity began. And today there are 2.1 billion Christians in the world. And our last religion of the West, is the religion of Islam. Islam is known as the religion of submission to Allah. It was founded in 622 of the Common Era. The founder was Muhammad ibn Abdullah. The place of origin was Mecca, the city of Mecca in Arabia, and the sacred writing is known as the Quran. So we have heard the story about Abraham and Sarah and their son Isaac, who is the progenitor of the Hebrew people. But before that child was born, Sarah was already old and believed to be barren. And so according to custom and law, she went to Abraham and said, go into my handmaiden, whose name was Hagar, and impregnate her. And then the child she has, I can legally claim as my own. And Abraham did that, and Hagar gave birth to a son, and they named him Ishmael. Islam says that when Isaac was born, Abraham and Sarah cast Hagar and Ishmael out, and they wandered around into the desert until they were about to die of thirst. And then Ishmael, in anger, kicked the ground, and a well of pure, sparkling, clean water sprang up out of the ground. Islam says that when Abraham heard that, he went to that spot and he built a temple beside that well. And he brought with him a black stone, a kind of talisman, or maybe even an idol that his family had carried around. And the tradition was that this stone had been brought out of the Garden of Eden by Adam. And he placed this stone in the eastern corner of that temple. Now, have you seen pictures of what's known as the Kaaba, the giant rectangular feature in Mecca, which the Muslims make the Hajira, the pilgrimage to, and they walk round and round and round it? That's the site of the temple, and the black stone from the Garden of Eden is believed by Muslims to be inside of that big rectangle, which is called the Kaaba. So Ishmael grew up there around the well and the temple that Abraham built. And then tradition says that his descendants built the city of Mecca around the well and that sacred site of the temple. Now, this is a very important thing for us not to miss. Abraham had a son named Isaac, who was the progenitor of the Jewish peoples. Abraham and Hagar had a son named Ishmael, who was the progenitor of the Arabic peoples. Even the conflict in the Middle East today between Arabs and Jews, the fight over land, who are the real descendants of Abraham, originated right here with the origin of these two religions, Judaism and Islam. So then about let me say first of all, the ancient Arabs, the people who lived around the city of Mecca, were nature worshipers and they were idol worshipers. In fact, after the city of Mecca was built, they had 360 giant idols. Each of them had its own name and each of them had its own temple. Now, all of these different Arabic peoples on the Arabian Peninsula were connected by their belief in this holy city, by the Kaaba, by the well, and all of that, all of those traditions. But they were fiercely aggressive tribes of people, and they began fighting each other until everything fell apart. Nothing could seem to hold them together anymore. Their society literally began to disintegrate into chaos all around them. And that's when a child was born into one of the aristocratic families of Mecca, and they named him Muhammad ibn Abdullah, Muhammad the son of Abdullah. There are a lot of miracle stories, divinity legends around his birth. One of them is that when Muhammad was born, all 360 of those idols began to tremble. All we really know about his childhood is that when he was 6 years old, both of his parents died, and he was sent to live with his uncle Abu Talib, who refused to allow him to be educated. And so the tradition is that Muhammad was never educated, that he actually grew up being a camel driver. But the tradition says he was the most gorgeous human being who ever walked on the planet. Tradition says this man was so beautiful that he stunned people with his physical beauty. And because of that, he attracted the attention of Khadijah, who was a very wealthy widow, 15 years his senior, already had 3 children, but she proposed to him and they got married. And they lived together apparently happily for about 10 years. But then he began to look around at what was happening in his society. Literally everything was crumbling around him. Now, Muhammad had been exposed to both Judaism and Christianity. And so he decided that the only way to put his culture and society back together was for the people to have one prophet and be directed to worship one God. And so he literally walked around through the temples of all of these different idols and chose one whose name happened to be Allah. And he walked into the temple of Allah and he shouted, La ilaha illa Allah Muhammad Rasulullah, which means there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. In other words, he was saying, see this guy behind me here, he's the only real God and I'm his prophet and all the rest of this is just nonsense. And then he began preaching, and he preached against drinking, and he preached against the gambling, and he preached against sexual promiscuity. And he was just a kind of wet blanket on all of these people who had some really good things going there. And so the merchants in Mecca decided that he had to be done away with. And so they hired somebody to murder him. And he found out about the plot and was forced to flee. And he ran about 270 miles away to the city of Yathrib, and he began teaching there. And his teachings were accepted there. They loved him there. They even made him the ruler of the city, and they changed the name of the city to Medina, the city of the prophet. And from Medina, Muhammad put together a giant army, and he literally waged war against the political powers in Mecca. He won several very impressive military battles, and that was the beginning. And that set him up to be able to present his teachings of one God. There is only one God, Allah, and I am God's prophet. So that's how the religion of Islam began. And today there are about 1.2 billion adherents to the religion of Islam in the world.
Woo!
Questions?
Or just applause. Oh my goodness, Ken. If I was there, I'd bring you a cup of tea.
I've got some cold tea right here.
Oh,
Green
fabulous.
tea.
Roger, is that a question? Is that a hand up for a question or is it a hand up for a clap?
It was an applause.
Okay, applause. There's no questions in the chat room. I think, Ken, people were listening so fast that they didn't type any questions. If anybody would like to, let's use it old fashioned and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask Ken anything about these last religions or even about the whole evening. I think would be okay to open up, Ken. And I want to also honor, it's about 12 minutes after the hour. So if you'd normally like to be with us for an hour, God bless, enjoy. But I know that the rest of us will hang out here a little bit and have a little chat like we usually do. So anybody, a question for Ken on these last three religions of the West?
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Did anybody notice anything about when these religions originated?
Barb did. Way back earlier this evening, Barb put a post in the chat room. I'm going way back here. Barb, why don't you jump in? Something about 6th century BC and spiritual seeking.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, there was something going on around the 6th century BCE.
There was something in the water.
Yep.
Yes, we talked about 10 religions tonight, and 5 of them began in the 6th century BC. 5 of these founders, Buddha, Mahavira, Zoroaster, Confucius, and Lao Tzu, could all have known each other. 5 of these 10 religions that began in prehistory and continued up today actually began at the same time. There are certain periods in history. One of them is when people began nature worship. The next one is when people began idol worship. The next one is when religion as we know it began to develop along the Ganges. And then the next one is the 6th century BC, when all of these reformers began trying to, it's like the birth of a new religious consciousness came into the world at that time. And there are others, of course, like the birth of Christianity, like the Reformation of Christianity in the 15th century. And there are many people today. Paul and I went to Houston a number of years ago to hear Reverend James Forbes preach, the greatest preacher in the English language. And we were privileged to hear him. And one of the things James Forbes says is that this is the new we're living right now in an age of renewed spiritual consciousness, unlike anything we've ever seen before. And there are numbers of other people who have said that same thing.
Yeah. Ken, there is one question again from Kristen. Thank you, Kristen. You're
yes,
using up your hand up there. Go ahead, Kristen.
Oh gosh, wow, sorry, my head's so spinning. I've actually taken philosophy and religion classes before, and I think you just taught me more in less than an hour than I learned in a whole semester. But Muhammad, you know, and he was exposed to Judaism and Christianity. He knew what those were. He was kind of going for something based on some of those things. But did he think that the Jews or even the Christians were going to like switch and follow him? Did he have that sense of converting people, or was he looking to convert a different group of people?
More the latter. I'm sure he was a very aggressive evangelist for his belief, that there was one God and he was that prophet. But the clue to the answer to your question is the fact that he acknowledged the truth of Judaism, and he said before him, Jesus was the greatest prophet. He believed himself to be the last in a succession of prophets. So he actually, in a way, honored Judaism and Christianity as being the forerunner of what he was presenting as a new way of understanding God and himself as God's prophet.
Thank you.
And Ken, one person's just checking, when you say James Forbes, is that, that's James Forbes of Riverside Church that you're speaking about?
Yep.
Greatest preacher? Yep. There you go.
Yep.
And Paul, jump on, Paul.
Let me tell you a real fast story, which is really fun. Paul and I and Larry Bethune, who at that time was the pastor of University Baptist Church here in Austin, went to Houston to hear Reverend Forbes preach. And of course, he just preached the walls down. It was just the most amazing experience you can imagine. And when he quit preaching and sat down, Larry Bethune leaned over to me and said, "Is that what we're supposed to be doing on Sunday mornings?"
I was just gonna comment, Ken, that years ago I heard Dr. Forbes preach at Riverside Church in New York City, and I wrote down one of the quotes from his sermon that day, and when I was the pastor at Memorial Chapel at Fort Myer in the Military District of Washington, one of the members of the congregation, who was a calligrapher, just wrote that quote out, and I had it framed, and it's on my dining room table to this day. And the quote says, "Grace is like finding love in bloom where the climate is too cold for it to grow."
Oh,
Wow.
But it's
just like,
amen.
I've got a question for Ken when he gets back.
I don't know.
yes,
where-
I'm back.
He's
Oh,
back.
you can hear this. So Ken, as you
Yes.
talked about how these various world religions came about, there was a lot of trauma involved in the birth of these religions, especially fear and anger. And even to this day, those seem to be trademarks of even religion as we see it in our country today. I'd just like to hear your comments about that.
Yes. Yeah. Again, there are people who say, religion has done more harm than anything else in the world. And it is easy to make a case for, horrible things that have been done in the name of false religion. But one of the things that Dr. Forbes has said is that the Reformation we're in now is recovering what religion is supposed to be, that it is a positive presentation of God as this jealous lover, who just passionately loves us and will do anything possible, to make us see that and understand that and live, according to that. And I think that's probably true, because fear has certainly been used. And I mean, when I was a Southern Baptist child, they terrorized me. I would go listen to my Southern Baptist preacher uncles preach about hell, and I'd go home, I couldn't sleep, all night. There is a kind of fundamentalist Christianity, which is a uniquely violent form of child abuse. And it is telling little children that they may die and go to hell, and burn forever. And so I think part of the Reformation that's happening today, is a dispelling, a rejection of those motives for being religious, like fear. Let me read you, when you said that, Paul, I'm going to do this and I'm going to shut up, I promise. This is a quote from Dr. Forbes that I have on the bulletin board in my office. It says, "God is gathering an interfaith company of believers to proclaim a theology of divine righteousness, which demands justice, respect, tolerance, compassion, inclusiveness, trust in the ultimate efficacy of divine zeal, and the rigorous pursuit of peace in the midst of competing interests and faith claims." He says God is putting something new together in the world today, and it will be the thing that religion was originally meant to be.
Oh, goodness. Paul, I have one request for you to type your quote in the chat box, if you wouldn't mind. And what I'll do, or you can send it to me in a message if you want, and I will put that into a quote into a slide for next week. You've touched some hearts there. And then Barb, you've got a comment here, I think, just to the whole group.
Just in general, I don't even remember, which preacher said it, but was commenting on like the failures of Christianity or the failings of Christianity and Christians, and said that some people say that Christianity is a failure as a religion, as an experiment. Personally, he said, I think it's never really been tried.
That's right. Gandhi, yes, Gandhi said I would be a Christian if I had ever met one.
I have I don't know if it's a question or a comment. So this goes back to Barb's observation about the 6th century BCE. And what's been interesting to me as I watch nerd TV, to calm my brain down, what I call nerd TV. Ancient cultures, I mean, we have historical evidence of human beings in cave paintings going back 27,000 years.
Yes.
And so we have cultures like the Vikings, the Native Americans, whoever was responsible for Stonehenge, who simply didn't have a written alphabet, a way to record what they believed. And their structures, Chaco Canyon, they're so complex and based largely on the sun, the rising sun and the equinoxes. And it's easy to attribute those simply to animism or something else, but I suspect their thought processes were much more complex than we give them credit for. We just don't have a written record like we do in all of the religions you talked about tonight.
Yes, I think I don't doubt that a bit. In fact, I mean, even a cursory look at nature religion, the way we did it tonight, doesn't do it justice. That is an extraordinarily complex understanding of reality. The idea that everything has its own unique living spirit, and how as a human being you're supposed to relate to that. That's not a simple thing, at all. And so I agree with you. I think that there's certainly evidence among Native Americans and some of the cave paintings, in Northern Europe, of some very sophisticated and complex theological thinking there. So I have no doubt you're absolutely right about that.
That was actually what I was going to bring up about Aboriginals, and that are said to go back 50,000 years. I don't know if that's true, but very, very simple, but very socially oriented or intergenerationally oriented about passing along stories and song to next generations. So I think we've always had this desire and this yearning to know God and to know our place in all of this, whether we've called it a religion or not.
Yes. When I was in Australia, I was told that there were Aboriginal peoples in Australia who could recite 10,000 names in perfect order every time as a way of honoring their ancestors. And I thought, how far back must that go? Who started that and how they passed it down from generation. 10,000 names in perfect order every time, just as a way of honoring, their ancestors.
Wow.
We need to get their DNA so we can help our memory.
All right, my friends, it is 9:27. I love you, but I'm also going to love you and leave you. So Paul, if you might offer that quote, if you could get that quote to me in just a message or something, I'll put it up next week for a slide. And obviously you're here this week. If you'd like, if you found value tonight, please join us next Tuesday night when Ken will answer all those questions he wouldn't answer tonight about what the religions actually believed. not just how they were crafted and how they were born. I also want to always remind you again.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that again. Go ahead and unmute and give Ken some love.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you,
great.
And we're excited
Thank
to
you,
bring
Ken. Really appreciate it.
Thanks,
our
Kim.
panel
Thank you.
and our book club. And then we're again incredibly excited to put CLM online in March. So mark your calendars for Tuesdays, my friends. Don't miss. Come on back. We love you.
Peace be with you.
Love
Good
you.
night.
Thank you.
Thanks.